Hi and welcome to another video. In today's video, I want to speak about interview red flags that you should not ignore, especially when you experience them during the recruitment process. So, I know you cannot really be 100% sure of how a job will look like or how working in an organization will look like before you actually get there. But there are signs, or rather there are things that can happen during an interview process that if you're observant of or if you're really keen, or if you ask the right questions during an interview, can help you tell or can help you gauge how your life will look like in that organization. So specifically in today's video, I want to speak about 10 interview red flags that you should never ignore when you're going through an interview process. So my name is Nelia Kungu. If you want to learn this so you actually don't make mistakes when you're going through the interview process, or rather you don't get to land in an organization that you'll realize later that do not align to your values, please stick till the end. So let's get into it. Number one red flag that you should never ignore during a job interview is too many reschedules of an interview. Of course, I understand people are busy and things can come up when an interview has been scheduled that can lead to a reschedule, but it is important to know how many reschedules are normal. So for instance, let's say you're scheduled for an interview for the first time, then a reschedule happens. For the first time, it can be okay. And of course, it needs to come up with a valid reason why they're deciding to reschedule an interview. So again, if it happens the second time, it may be okay. It may be okay if it happens for the second time, especially when a valid reason is provided. But when it goes to the third time, if an interview is rescheduled 3 times, then this should begin to raise your eyebrows. So in an instance where an interview is being rescheduled for the third time, then you should begin to now question. Because what this could actually mean is that number one, in that organization, there's a lot of disorganization. Then number two, it could also mean that they do not prioritize or rather value candidate or job seekers' time. So if an interview is scheduled more than 2 times and scheduled the third time, whether with a valid or a non-valid reason, and you should begin to ask yourself whether or not you want to proceed and be in such an organization. Because again, you remember, even for you, when you're planning yourself for an interview, you've actually maybe prepared. Even if you're still employed, you've asked for a day off or so. And again, if an interview is being rescheduled the third time, this also really inconveniences you. So that is the first red flag that you should never ignore when you're going through an interview process. Then the second red flag that you should never ignore is ghosting. Sometimes there's a lot of ghosting that happens, and job seekers always are, of course, complaining that they do not receive feedback after going through an interview. So for the type of ghosting that I'm talking about in this video is, for instance, if you'd gone through a first level interview, then they promise to give you feedback, let's say after 2 weeks or after 1 week, then they don't give you that feedback. Then maybe later, after 2 months, someone else calls you and tells you, without any feedback between that duration, they call you and tell you that they want to reschedule you for a second level interview. Of course, you go for that interview, then they keep quiet, they ghost you, and again, after maybe another 1 month or another 4 months, they reappear and call you again for another interview. So if they schedule for this interview, you attend the interview, then again, they keep quiet, then again, after another 3 months or another 2 months, they get back to you and maybe they tell you maybe the next step. So again, you'll be wondering maybe what is it that is happening during that time. So that type of ghosting that a recruiter or an employer goes silent, then gets back to you after an unreasonable period of time, is another red flag that you should really not ignore should it happen when you're going through an interview process. The third red flag that you should not ignore is inappropriate questions or comments during an interview. So I've seen instances where people go for interview and they complain that they are asked questions that do not align to the interview. The most important thing that you should always bear in mind that a good interview should have well-structured questions, and of course questions that is aligned to what is in the job description. So when you get into an interview and you're asked inappropriate questions, it is something that should really bother you and should really make you dig deeper to get to understand what type of an organization that is. So So inappropriate questions that do not align to the job that you're being interviewed for. Inappropriate questions could be personal questions. I know there are some personal questions that you can be asking in an interview, of course, to help the panel make a decision. But when there are personal questions that even yourself you're not comfortable answering, you can begin to question how your life will look like in that organization, or how professional are the people in that panel. So inappropriate questions is one red flag that you should never ignore in an interview. The next red flag that you should not ignore is excessive number of interviews. So you can ask yourself, how many is too many? A good interview or a good recruitment process should not have too many interview levels. So for instance, in a typical recruitment process, if you go through a first level interview, then you call for a second level, a third level, a fourth level, fifth level. So again, that also shows indecisiveness, because it is important that if you're not able to have all the decision makers in the first level, then at least the next level decision makers should be in the second level interviews. And if you're being hired through a recruiter and you've gone through the interview process with the recruiter, and the final interview with the client should be at least one interview. I see instances where people do interviews even 6 times, and the long run, maybe they do not get those jobs. So too many interviews is another red flag that you should never ignore. Even if you're being hired through a recruiter, you go through an interview, then once you hand it over to the client, again, you take another series of an interview. That could also indicate, or rather show, a great deal of indecisiveness. So again, another red flag that you should never ignore during an interview process is scheduling interviews during off hours. So off hours, I know nowadays, the world being digital, people can sometimes have interviews beyond or past working hours. And of course, also if it is an interview where the two, that means the employer, or rather the employer and the candidates, are in 2 different localities which have different timings, then it can be during off hours. But now the off hours that I'm speaking about here is when it is consistent. And let's say maybe all your interviews, you're either being interviewed, especially if you're in the same locality, you're being scheduled for an interview, let's say 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. or at night, if your employer is not in a different country. And also, let's say maybe you're being scheduled for interviews over the weekend. I know there's some organizations that work over the weekend, but if you're being scheduled for interviews over the weekend and late hours, then you can begin to question the type of culture in that organization. It all depends. If you're all within the same locality as that employer, then you're being scheduled for those interviews during weird or off hours, then that is a red flag that you should never ignore in an interview. So again, another red flag that you should never ignore during a job interview is speaking badly about people who are not present in that interview. I will call it like maybe gossiping colleagues in an interview. If you go to an interview, then you hear them speak badly about people or about members of their teams who are not in that interview, it actually shows you that that organization, people are in silos, are cultured by teams who do not work or rather collaborate together. So if you get an interview where the panel speaks about the other people or the other members of the team who are not present in that interview, then you can begin to question what type of organization that is. Another red flag that you should not ignore is either too long or too short interview. The timing of an interview is determined by the type of role is being interviewed for. Maybe depending on the role size, of course, for instance, you don't expect an entry-level role to last for the same period, maybe as to have the same period with maybe a top-level role. So the timing is hugely determined by the type of the role. And again, the timing can also be determined by the number of the panelists. The more the panelists, the larger or the bigger the panel, the more the timing. So again, back to my point, is too long or too short interview is an indicator of either disorganization or something that should really raise your eyebrows. So if you ever went for an interview and maybe you're interviewed for like 3 or below 5 minutes, then you'll begin to question whether entry or top level, a well-structured interview can never last for less than 5 minutes. You need to weigh and be cognizant of the time that they take to interview you. Then the next red flag that you should never ignore is when you're interviewed by a panel and no one in that panel has stayed in that organization for too long. And let me just maybe give a specific time. Let's say you're in a panel where everyone is less than 1 year in that organization. So what that shows you again is on the retention of the organization. It will be very weird to find that almost everyone in the organization is new. So when you say that almost everyone in that organization is new, or everyone in that panel has not stayed with that organization for more than 1 year, or all of them are maybe less than 1 year, then it can begin to worry you on why is it that everyone in that organization is new? Why is it that the organization has recently hired maybe almost for every role? So that is another red flag that you should never ignore when you observe it in an interview. The next red flag that you should never ignore is when you go to an interview where the HR is not present. Of course, the HR department is the department that is mandated with the recruitment function. So imagine going to an interview where the HR is not present in the interview. Then that should begin to worry you. When hiring and when you're being hired directly by a potential employer, HR is the first department that should be in the interview. Then the other department that should be in the interview are the key stakeholders that will work together with this role. For example, if you're being hired for business development role, so the HR will be there and maybe someone from business and another stakeholder from another department that you'll be working with closely. Maybe someone will be consuming your report, or someone whose reports you'll be consuming, or someone you'll be working with closely in one way or the other. So if you ever go to an interview where the HR is not present in the interview, then that should begin to worry you as well. And another point that you should consider, another red flag that you should never ignore as well, is unreasonably low offer. If you're interviewed in an organization that gives you unreasonably low offer, and let's say sometimes even an offer that is much lower than what you're currently earning, so that should begin to worry you. And what that should tell you is that this organization is not cognizant of the market pricing, because for each and every role there is a market range, a minimum pay line that any organization should not go below. So if you go to an organization, do an interview, then thereafter they offer you unreasonably low offer, then this should begin to worry you. Apart from them not just being cognizant about the market pricing or the market range, then it can also tell you that they do not even pay their employees well, because an organization will only always pay you as determined by the market range for that role, and also as determined by their internal pay lines. So if their offer is too low, then that can also tell you that even the internal pay lines are quite low. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've not subscribed to this channel, please click that subscribe button and put the notification bell on so that you get notified whenever I upload a new video. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video.